Well, look, I think I have a concern always, as I did. You can see the port of Elizabeth in New Jersey when Dubai Ports World wanted to buy it, and I led a charge against it. Critical infrastructure. So I am concerned. I'm not against all foreign investment by any stretch of the imagination. But when it goes to critical infrastructure and then the depth of scope of how far in that critical infrastructure a company can take over, and when you have a foreign company can take over, and when you have a country that does not share our values and are in direct contradiction with them, well, all of those elements together, yes, makes a real concern for me. So I look at it on a case-by-case basis, but at the end of the day, it's the totality of all of the circumstances that motivates me to act. Do you want to? My view is maybe nothing at the beginning, maybe absolutely nothing. But if and when we have seen Russia in the world use energy as not just an opportunity to build its economy, because Russia is basically an extracting economy, meaning it takes out of the ground what it has, oil and natural gas, and at the end of the day, that's really the biggest part of the Russian economy. But it has been willing to use that which it should be doing to build the fortunes of its own people for geopolitical purposes, as Ms. Harris suggested. And so we saw that in Ukraine, willing to deny or attempt to deny or to dramatically say, no, you have to now pay us exorbitant prices for gas, which was critical to Ukraine during its winter, at a moment that it was at its weakest. You see the potential threat to Europe, which is why Europe has now moved to try to diversify where it gets its energy from, because it doesn't want to be held hostage. So the answer to your question, maybe on day one, nothing. Maybe a year from now, nothing. But when Russia thinks that it is possible or that it can ultimately affect that, then we are at its mercy. And when I hear, I didn't even quite truly appreciate Ms. Harris's comments that 75% of the world's oil is in the hands of state-owned entities. You have to think about that and the consequences of it, and not believe that everybody will just be an economic actor, that they will use that resource that they have to pursue their national goals. And when those national goals are adverse to us, to think about it then is too late. And so those are all elements. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah. I would just add two additional things. One, a lot of people might say, rightly, the U.S. is really coming online as a net energy exporter. So what if Russia attempts to play petropolitics with this sliver of U.S. energy supplies? Actually, the problem, the greatest problem the U.S. faces in its energy security is not so much supply, it's infrastructure. And the bottlenecks are refineries and pipelines. And with CITGO comes major refineries and pipelines. And if I were sort of playing out a scenario where Putin could cause trouble if he wanted to, that's where I would expect he would go, sort of taking offline one of those refineries, just sort of saying, not going to show up to work today, guys, or blocking access to these pipelines, which because margins are low, spare capacity is pretty thin, those are even small changes to the ability for our energy and our oil to get where it needs to be can spike prices quite significantly.
So you're saying that Rosneft could use CITGO as a political weapon?
Correct. I think there's a lot of sort of leverage in the breach. It's true that they could take ownership and perhaps nothing changes the next day, but there is passive leverage there that could be exercised at a time and place of the Kremlin's choosing.
Yeah, I mean, look, Gazprom, which is another Russian entity, did exactly this to Ukraine. So why wouldn't Rosneft potentially do it if it found at a given point in time that to disrupt U.S. energy supplies or to create a challenge in the marketplace that could create economic disruption? Well, let's do that. We'll get the attention of the United States, and maybe they'll negotiate with us in a way that we otherwise can't get them to negotiate on things that they care about. So it is potentially a tool of economic blackmail. And so the question becomes, why would you submit yourself to that? Why would you submit yourself even to the possibility? So when I was concerned about, in a different iteration, Dubai Ports World, controlling the ports of the United States, critical infrastructure that generates so many jobs, economic activity, I was concerned about that infrastructure being taken over by an entity controlled by a foreign government that could dictate what happens at our ports. And so this is why there exists the Committee on Foreign Investments, because not every foreign investment is a challenge. But there are some foreign investments in critical infrastructure that you have to be concerned about, and you have to ask yourself, does not some critical infrastructure in our country ultimately have to be domestically owned? Because you cannot take the risk at the end of the day that a foreign entity would seek to disrupt it for the purposes of affecting foreign policy.
I would just add that if we needed one more good reason to do some real infrastructure reform and pass a meaningful infrastructure bill, this is a good one. Because if it isn't the Kremlin, it could be a hurricane. I think we saw the damage and the costs that we can all incur when hurricanes and natural disasters take out our refineries and our present capacity.
Well, first of all, there's two factors here. Rosneft and Igor Senchin is under sanctions. So the first thing is, while they're under sanctions, it seems to me that such sanctions should be a block towards being able to actually exercise, the 49.9%. And I would urge the administration certainly to continue to both keep those sanctions. Nothing has changed with Russia, certainly as to the original reasons we imposed those sanctions on. And if anything, Russia's latest engagement in Syria, indiscriminate bombing in Aleppo, what it's doing in the Baltic, and what it did in our own country in terms of a cyber attack attempting to affect our national elections, all cry out for not less but more. As a matter of fact, I am the co-sponsor of a bipartisan bill that is pending before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to ratchet up sanctions on Russia, and it would be my hope that the committee will hold that markup soon. So that's the first thing. Use the sanctions to make sure that this takeover can take place. Then secondly, to the extent that CFIUS can deny such a purchase, and this is two questions that are engaged here that give rise to another legislative question we have, which is, number one, is this a purchase in the traditional sense? And secondly, since this is a foreign government purchasing another foreign government's entity, which is a little different than what we normally have in CFIUS reviews, which is a foreign government attempting to purchase an American company's critical infrastructure or business. Does CFIUS actually have full jurisdiction there? That's an open question. In either event, either it cries out for keeping the sanctions, stopping the takeover to take place, should there be a default. Secondly, I would robustly urge them to look at the CFIUS process as a way. And if they fail there, I believe there are other executive powers, and I am ready to stand to pursue legislative powers to fill any gap that may exist in the process. But it seems to me that the sanctions element at least creates a stop, and if there's a need for a legislative response, we'll have time to deal with it. Yes?
So if the sanctions are in place and Venezuela defaults and that stops Russia, who would own the oil?
Well, I argue that the sanctions in place does that. Now, Rosneft may take another view, saying we are sanctioned for a different reason, but you can't stop a commercial transaction. I would argue that no, we can, because you're sanctioned, so you can't ultimately take over. That may be a disputed issue at the end of the day. But obviously, this is why the complexities of this particular transaction and what it means to us in the United States is something that I'm trying to get on the radar and get those who are in power to pay attention to, because I share Ms. Harris's view that Venezuela is in economic chaos as well as civil chaos, and at the end of the day, the possibility of their default, in my mind, is not too far away, and so therefore we should be ahead of the curve.
Senator, could you just elaborate a little bit on how the Secretary of State and Commerce sitting on this committee could influence
Well, the committee is comprised of the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, to mention a few. Obviously, they all have a history here with Russia. And so you have to make sure, this is why I call for a conflict-free process, to make sure that whatever decisions they make, that their first and foremost goal is the national security interests of the United States. Not suggesting that wouldn't be their first and foremost goal, but since there is a history here, and since there is a background, then it has to be very open and very transparent as to how you're making these decisions. And so these are actually issues that I've raised during some of the hearings and the nominations of these individuals. And so I'm just simply saying that, in addition to the complexities of this particular deal, we have, and because Russia is involved, that we have to make sure that it is very transparent as to how the CFIUS committee acts. Okay? Thank you all very much, and thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate it a great deal. Thank you. Yes.
So, forgive me for not knowing this, but CITGO is wholly owned by the Venezuelan government?
Yes. Yes.
And you had said, Jennifer, that's not a matter of if, but when.
Not my view. Yes,
Right.
my view.
When do you think, is there a rough
want to come
timeline
over
of
here.
when you think Venezuela might default? Or?
I would have to sort of look at a lot of their upcoming bond repayment schedules to understand like when the next large set of bills are coming due, and that would probably be what I would take to place a bet on.
Could you talk about how the bonds are rated?
Not well. I believe that I'm not sure if it was Fitch or Moody's sort of just came out with their latest guidance suggesting that Venezuela was in kind of functional default already. I'd have to go back to refer to exactly their terminology.